Hey guys, this is part 2 of my editing series, and this one is framework. So this is one that I did not think was very important until I started doing my editing. And the framework for writing is logic, research, and plot holes. All three very important and all work together to make your story more impactful and more um, just like more alive. And a common theme with these three logic, research, and plot holes is that they help to it helps your reader to keep their suspension of disbelief going. So if you don't know what suspension of disbelief is, it's when the reader is willing to say, okay, I know this story isn't real, but I'm just gonna forget about that right now and just immerse myself in the story and just enjoy it for what it is. And if you do a good enough job with these three, I think it'll really help readers to really believe that your story is real, even though they know it's not, if that makes sense. So the first one of these three is logic. And now, before I started getting feedback from my beta readers, I didn't think logic was necessary, or in reality, I didn't even think to really look into that. But in reality, it was just like a huge problem in my story, and all my readers were saying, wait, that does not make sense. The logic, the ramifications of this one incident does not make sense. None of it makes sense. And one big issue that they brought up in general is, so in my Viking book, a traumatic thing happens to my character, and she's afloat at sea for a week or two. She goes without food or water for a couple days. But then when she reaches land, she's able to just walk around that same day after some rest. And I was just thinking, while looking back on it, what was I thinking? That's insane. Like, no one can do that, Viking or no. And just like the emotional impact of the traumatic event itself would be devastating. So I had to take that into consideration and really do a lot of editing with that. So for every action in your story, you should ask yourself, why is it happening this way? What made the character decide to do it if this action is a response of theirs? And what other ways could it possibly happen? And what are the ramifications of this? Just think in real life terms. Even if your book is fantasy, just think in real life terms because that'll make it a lot better. And you can also ask your beta reader or critique partner or whatever to pay attention and ask if anything that happens in your story doesn't make sense. If something doesn't happen the way it would naturally, you should look into it and see if it's actually realistic and logical. And the second main point is research. So my native genre, I guess you could call it, is historical fiction. And in that genre, there's a lot of research. Like for anything from small details of an event, a historical event, or clothing, or food, or anything. Basically, you name it, you gotta research it. Even in fantasy, you need to do a little bit of research, like make sure if there are people in there that it's logical, back to the logic again. Just things of that sort. Make sure you know about this world so that you can easily craft the other world. And I found that research with fantasy is mostly you build that world, if you've been watching my why can't I think of its name right now? It's the Write With Me series that I'm doing. If you've been watching that, then you'll know that I spend a lot of time world building. And so research a lot of times with fantasy is world building and then sticking to that. So that is also challenging, but make sure you're researching for everything. So an example of research that's not done well, I'm not going to name the book, not going to name the author, and this is no disrespect to either of them because I so love this book. It is amazing. But there's these little historical details that the author did not research, and it drove me crazy. And one of them was the usage of the words stays and corsets. And since I love historical fashion and stuff, I know about this. Not every reader is going to know about it. But it just shows the lack of research in this aspect. She would use, well, just for a little bit of information here, corsets are used in like the 1800s. They're what we typically think of when we think of corsets, is like the ones that supposedly women tightened to like cinch down their waists, and they actually did not do that, by the way. And stays were in the 1700s and earlier, and they were not made for lacing tightly or anything like that. They were just for support. Two different garments. The stays eventually led to the corsets, but that's a whole nother thing. But in this book, the author referred to the corsets as stays at one point, but then she referred to them as corsets correctly. And corsets were always worn on top of a shift or an undergarment, not against the skin, and this author had a description where the corset was against the skin and another time it was not. So you see the consistency there, there is none. And it was very painful for me to read, and it took me out of the story and destroyed my suspension of disbelief. And you don't want that. So even though the author did not think it was worth or didn't think of researching this, it just goes to show that some people will know about this topic and you need to make sure that you have it all figured out. Don't need to have it completely figured out. We can't know everything about history, but that's when you need to go back to the logic and say, okay, I know this is true about this. And so with that in mind, how would these people go about doing this other thing? Just like headscarves with the Vikings. People don't really know if women wore headscarves just during work or if it was a status sort of thing, because Viking men, to show their wealth and their status, they would have several wives, or they'll have slaves that are like their wives, but they actually have an actual wife and all these slaves. And some people think that only the wife had the headscarf, while people think women in general did. So it's very vague, very gray area. So I had to take some. I had to think through that real carefully and take what I knew about other cultures and other time periods and see if I could come to a logical conclusion. But then I had to stick with that. So that's another example of research. All right, plot holes. Every writer's nightmare. I hope you've heard about plot holes. If not, they're when your writing is inconsistent, such as when details or events don't add up, causing a hole in your plot. They can be tiny little details that change, kind of like the corsets versus stays thing that I mentioned, or it can be something big, and no matter what it is, it will cause problems. The little ones won't add up to a big plot hole, so you don't want that. So an example is, let's say you mention a group of people and you say they're from this particular place. But then the next time these people are mentioned, maybe a story is being retold by a character and they mention these people, but then they say they're from a different place. So that doesn't really add up, does it? And that is a plot hole. And that's not necessarily wrong, having people be said to have come from two different places. You just need to have a reason for that inconsistency. If you don't have a reason, then the reader is going to be like, they don't know what they're talking about. This is ridiculous. And another example might be one that I found in my own story. In the very beginning, the main character's brother goes on a raid with other people from their village to this one place that has a monastery. And there are monks there, and they mention those. But then in a different place in the book, it mentions monks, and the question came up as, why would they attack them? Are they the same monks? Or like, what caused this? And so I had to think through this and try to think of reasons for the characters to do what they did, and if the monks were the same monks, which I decided no, they were not the same ones. So yeah, listen to your beta readers. Beta readers are very important. And what matters with plot holes, to make sure you don't get any, is to remember reasoning and consistency. You can have anything happen in your novel, but it always has to have a reason. Otherwise, you're just left with a bunch of shoulder shrugging. It just happened. That's just the way it happened. No, characters won't accept that. And so you always need a reason. And once you have a reason and you have something that has happened, you need to stick with it and have consistency. Because that will also lead to plot holes if you don't have consistency. So, all these three, logic, research, and plot holes, they are all walls holding up the roof of your story. So you need to make sure all your walls are solid and that your foundation is solid for this to hold up. This is why I put these three in the framework of the story, because they really are the framework. Once you have the foundation of the story, you need the framework, and that holds up everything else. And without the framework, things will fall apart. So, we're making progress in our house building. I hope that was helpful for you. And yeah, if I missed anything that you think should be mentioned, I would love to hear about it in the comments. And also, just take into consideration these things when you're editing or writing, and it'll just save a lot of time and effort and when you're doing the writing process. For when you're editing, it'll save you time when you're editing if you consider these things in your writing. That's why the plotting in my Write With Me series, if you haven't seen that, go check that out. That's why my plotting technique is important to me, because I think about the main actions of characters before I write, so that I have it all planned out and hopefully it'll all make sense what's on the page. So, hope this was helpful, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!